Hello from Geneva, and thanks for joining the New Humanitarian for our first Behind the Headlines webinar, exploring the ideas and issues behind some of our most recent coverage. I'm Josephine Schmidt, the executive editor of the New Humanitarian. Today, we're taking a close-up look into some of the topics and thinking behind our third annual 10 Crises and Trends to Watch feature. 10 Crises has become a January tradition in our newsroom, and for many of our readers, it's among one of our most read articles of the year. I'm joined by 4 of my editorial team colleagues, whom I'll introduce as we jump into our discussion, and who will be speaking to you from Geneva as well as elsewhere around the world, places like Bangkok and Nairobi, part of our global newsroom and part of the brain trust behind the 10 Crises. Before we jump in, just a little bit of housekeeping so we all know where we're going. We're going to spend about 20 minutes or so discussing why we chose a few of this year's entries. You should see the list on your screen now and why we think they really need to be on our radar and on yours for the coming year. Really, we look at this list or this feature as a plan for where we will be on the ground this year, how we're going to explore how more lives and livelihoods are being upended, and perhaps some even rebuilt throughout 2020. We'll then take another 20 minutes or so for a Q&A, and we're happy to elaborate more on the crisis we've chosen to highlight or to jump into others. So don't be shy about pitching questions to us throughout the session. Use the Q&A tab on the bottom menu of your Zoom screen. And thanks to those of you who have already submitted questions in advance. Just for a sense of where our list comes from, at the heart of it really are questions. And in fact, that's the heart of what we do as journalists. We ask informed and hopefully interesting questions. With our list, we don't set out to devise a dutiful list where we flag all the usual suspects, the worst, the most, the largest, the least reported. You know and can probably guess what's on such lists. The Syrias, Venezuela, DRC, Rohingya. Those lists are there and they're useful in their own way. But we hope that what we've put together is more than a list. We're trying to flag issues that we believe will play an outsized role in the business of humanitarian aid in 2020. We want to be a bit more forward-looking and hopefully even more provocative. We want to challenge you and ourselves to think more expansively about what drives humanitarian need, meaning what drives people from their homes and their futures, and what stands in the way of responding more effectively to those needs. We're interested in why we're reporting from places on so many other lists and where we, and likely you, will want to be next. So in putting together a 10 crises list, we begin with an obvious question. What's changed over the regions we cover? That might seem silly, but so much of what we cover and what you probably deal with day to day are ongoing crises. Syria, food insecurity across parts of Africa, as well as elsewhere, Venezuela's implosion, Rohingya and Bangladesh, and those still in Myanmar. So how do we define new in an ongoing crisis? That's the question we asked when Obi Anyadike, our senior editor for Africa, suggested the rise of extremist violence in the Sahel as one of our entries.
I think the reason why we chose Burkina Faso is just basically the speed and scale of the problem. Just to add a few numbers, and I'll use them very sparingly, but in 2019, at the beginning of the year, there was just 80,000 IDPs, and now we're up to more than 500,000, so a six-fold increase. So, I mean, what we're seeing is increasing attacks in the north and the east, which are really emptying those regions, especially around the border regions with Mali and Niger. And people are just running. The violence has been intense. The last traumatic attack involving civilians was in a place called Abinda, where 35 civilians were killed. So it really is enormous in terms of the violence and the scale of the violence and the needs. Obviously, we're seeing an IDP crisis. There aren't any formal IDP camps, so people are having to shack up with friends and relatives. We're seeing a food crisis. There's the difficulties in terms of access for the humanitarians to these areas, because obviously the insecurity problem. And then we have a humanitarian operation, which is trying to now steer its way away from what was before a developmental mandate and into a more emergency type response, which is difficult to do midstream. And as ever, there's always a money problem. I think the last count was that the appeal was 50% underfunded. So the needs are huge, much more needs to be done, but the resources are challenging. And our reporting has tried to kind of reflect that. Just a little bit on the context, Burkina Faso has not always been, kind of cockpit to violence. There's always been a moderate, tolerant society, but unfortunately it's in a bad neighborhood. So it's kind of sandwiched between Niger and Mali, which have been in turmoil for many, many years. And with the fall of its former leader, Blaise Compaoré, in 2016, the state was definitely weakened. And in a sense, that's given an opportunity for the rise of these militant groups and a proliferation of them. Most of them are coming from across the borders, but there's also homegrown groups as well. Initially, the government institutions were the targets, but now it's everybody. It's public services and it's ordinary civilians. And that's partly driven by what's happened in the government outsourcing some of the security to self-defense militia. And we're seeing a kind of an identity politics where certain groups of people are identified as part of the jihadist extremist groups, and that in particular involves the Fulani. So we're seeing communities being revenge attacks on communities, which is driving those same communities often into the arms of jihadist groups to protect them. And one of the few things that we know for sure in this type of extremist violence is that revenge is often a driver. If people have been oppressed by the security forces, which unfortunately Human Rights Watch has warned us is happening, where we're having arbitrary killings, extrajudicial killings by the security forces, we are creating a bigger problem. And the UN is now warning of much worse to come in what is already fragile communities.
Thanks, Obi. You've spoken a bit about what we saw in Burkina Faso. I'm curious to know about the regional impact. What is the spread or the impact beyond Burkina Faso?
Yeah, I mean, Mali has been the center of this, and we've seen a spread from Mali, Niger. Nigeria is also part of that kind of arc of instability. Mauritania has always been there as well, but it's more than the Sahel. We're seeing a militancy movements that, by my last count, are at least 12 countries. And that's from kind of long-established jihadist violence in Algeria to more shadowy groups in Mozambique and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in a sense, they're looking, what we hear from the propaganda is they're looking to create an alternative state based on Sharia law. And in some of these protest states, we're seeing services provided, we're seeing justice meted out in a more traditional sense and far quicker than the state has been able to achieve. We're seeing corruption being people who are corrupt brought to book. And in a sense, there is some popular support for this. And if what we tend not to ask is, the question of why people are joining jihadist groups. And quite often, people respond is because of an ideological commitment to what the jihadists are propagating. And that's a powerful allure. I mean, this isn't uniform. In Nigeria, we've got Shekau, who does his throat slitting and hand cutting thing. But there are a number of groups who generally say that their approach is an anti-Western throwback to a pre-colonial kind of system that serves people better. I mean, not everybody, is ready to abandon. I mean, some of the interesting research surveys are asking people about what do they want to see, and a lot of people will say, yes, we want Sharia, but also we want a democratic political system. We just want you guys to stop killing people. Right? That's often is the kicker. But there's growing. I mean, how does this all end? I mean, there's growing calls for dialogue, and which has reached a different stage in a number of these countries. And but there is also, as I think we'll discuss later, there's also a kind of a push towards militarization, and we're seeing a doubling down by international forces and domestic forces that there is a military solution, even though we might disagree with that. And for sure, and particularly in the Sahel, it's no secret that Western military intervention has a lot to do with Western security, and maybe a little less to do with the countries of the Sahel. There's issues around halting migration and stopping jihadism in the Sahel, so it's not exported, if we believe in these kind of domino theories, to the West.
Thanks, Obi. I hope we'll have time a little bit later to talk a bit more about the Western response and what's working and what isn't working. But to turn for a minute to what's working and what isn't working in a situation that is the same yet different, I'd like to turn to Yemen and to Annie Slemrod, who's been reporting from the Mideast since 2010, and she's been our Mideast editor since 2016. In that role, she's overseen coverage of some of the largest humanitarian crises in recent years, both in terms of the scale of need and funding. Think Syria, think Yemen here. Annie, we're not in the business of ranking misery with our 10 crises list or with any of our reporting, but Yemen is certainly up there if ranking is your thing. Most media coverage of Yemen, which isn't so easy to come by of late, includes the phrase world's worst humanitarian crisis. What exactly does that mean in terms of lives on the ground with 80% of the population in need of some sort of aid?
Thanks, Josephine. Like you said, I'm not a huge fan of ranking crises, but by any metric, things are quite bad in Yemen. 80% of the population of Yemen is 24 million people. So what that ends up looking like on the ground is people who need all sorts of kinds of help. And perhaps more significantly, the needs they have really overlap. So the economy has collapsed. The healthcare sector is in a really, really bad state. Lots of people can't afford to buy food, even if it is in the markets. And trash isn't being collected in cities at the same time that it's raining. So you have the situation in Yemen where people can't afford to get to a clinic for treatment, even if the treatment is free, or they can't, if they can't afford to buy food, then their immune systems are weakened, which is likely to make them more susceptible to diseases like cholera or dengue, which we're seeing a possible rise in right now. And even if you can afford to get to a clinic maybe one time, you can't necessarily afford the medication that you need to follow up on your condition, or there's no way of being sure that you're going to be able to get clean water when you get back home from the clinic. So these needs are severe, and they're overlapping in a way that starts to happen when a war lasts for such a long time. I would say, the needs, we see the same number, the UN is saying that the same number of people need help this year as needed help last year. But we know that data in Yemen is pretty unreliable, but I think it's fair to say that the needs probably change on a daily basis, but it's bad, and it's not getting any better as far as we can see.
Annie, last year around this time, talk of peace was in the air. A year later, it's still in the air. So what's different about the chatter now than what was being said a year ago?
Yeah, so it's back. It seems that every December we have some new peace talks to discuss in Yemen. Last year it was about this Hodeidah agreement and how that could possibly lead to the end of the war. We were skeptical at the time, but and I think we were right to be skeptical in many ways, although the agreement did avert a full-scale urban warfare and the famine that a lot of people had been warning about, but it didn't end the war. And now we have new talks with new players. The United Arab Emirates, which is was a key member of the Saudi Arabia-led anti-Houthi coalition, has all but pulled out of the country. So Saudi Arabia is talking to the Houthis. There's this agreement around the south, but that still hasn't really come to fruition. The Hodeidah deal still hasn't come to fruition. So we are talking about peace in a way, but we're also sort of waiting to see how it plays out. And of course, probably most important for us, for our reporters and for the civilians we cover, the question is whether any of this will open up avenues for humanitarian access and perhaps more importantly for commercial trade, because frankly, although a lot of people rely on aid, commercial trade makes a bigger difference to more people.
And if it doesn't open up access?
Well, I mean, there's as much as people say Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis, it could certainly get worse. Over the weekend, there was the most probably recent attack there was a missile that hit a military parade, and I think 80 people reported killed. And that's actually in a part of the country that has been touted as an extremely stable part of the country that's self-governing and was a model of is considered a model of governance for a lot of the country. So I mean, the counter narrative to this sort of glimmer of hope that there's peace talks and et cetera is that it could get a lot worse. I mean, we've said it before that as much as it's when you're writing an article, it's easiest to say that Yemen's conflict has two sides. For any war, it's easiest to do that. But the fact is there are a lot of sides within each side, and things could fracture even more. It's possible there could be violence, as there often is in peace talks, as spoilers to the deal. And the country's already fragmenting. We saw that in Aden before this recent deal for the South. And there are parts of the country that are effectively, they have their own militias, they have their own alliances, they have their own weapons, and they have their own sources of funding and power. And I think that ongoing fragmentation it also impacts the people who live there. It impacts how they live their lives and how who they go to when they need things, basic things that you need for your life.
To pivot for a bit from geographic specific crises to wider trends, I'd like to turn to Irwin Loy, who's our Asia editor, joining us from Bangkok. He's been based in Asia since 2009, covering everything from urbanization to escaped crocodiles, not always for us. There's an old saying, geography is destiny. So maybe that's why Irwin has become our go-to climate change expert, among other things. Communities throughout Asia have been among the first to live with the harsh and ongoing impacts of climate change. Irwin, we included climate displacement on our 2019 list. And this year, we've gone a bit broader, looking at how the impacts of climate change are risk multipliers in many humanitarian situations. What exactly does that mean when we talk about a risk multiplier?
Hi, thanks, Josephine. Well, I think there's this tendency to think of climate change as this, far away apocalyptic scenario with, millions of people displaced and disappearing islands and millions of climate refugees. And I think that really overlooks, what's already happening today. And if we do that, that means overlooking how humanitarian response and planning can adjust. At the same time, when disasters hit, I think there's always this rush to pronounce whether climate change is to blame and to what degree. And I think there are more nuanced ways to look at it. And so I think we're talking now about climate change being a risk multiplier, and what we see that meaning is that it exposes vulnerabilities that were already there. It drives up response costs, and it adds new fuel to already existing crises, including many of the other issues that we identify on this list and many of the crises that we cover day in and day out.
Can you offer some examples from Asia or elsewhere?
Yeah, well, I mean, you certainly see it when disasters grab the headlines. Last year, there were two powerful storms to hit Mozambique, which was unprecedented. That's a country that was already struggling with a massive amount of debt, and now it's taking on more loans to rebuild. So that, the disaster is one thing, and, certainly the signs of climate change are there in terms of how unusual those two storms were, but there were already existing problems that are, made much worse by such a big storm, or two of them. You've got conflict and climate change combining in food crisis. 8 of the world's worst food crises are linked to both. You've got the number of people in last year, I guess, 2019, the number of people in need exceeded original forecasts by 20 million, according to the UN, and it's only projected to go up very fast within a couple of years. And so I think, climate change here, it's not necessarily creating those crises that already exist, but it's prolonging them, and it's injecting new risks that make it harder to end some types of crises. On the ground here in Asia, we deal with floods on a seasonal basis. But it feels like it's getting worse each and every year. Last year in South Asia, it affected millions, hundreds of thousands were displaced, at least temporarily. In the Mekong region where I am, drought has already set in, even though the dry season is just underway, and we're not expecting any rains for weeks. But that's related to both climate and man-made causes. Obviously, hydropower dams on the Mekong River upstream play a big role in the current water levels of the Mekong, which are very, very low. So I think, just in general, the line between these sorts of seasonal challenges that everyone is used to facing and a humanitarian crisis is growing increasingly thin every year. And so climate change plays a big role in that, but it's not the only thing that drives these sorts of crises.
Oh, thanks, Erwin. So, it's one thing to acknowledge the amplification effects of climate change on existing humanitarian crises, and it's another to make some changes to start preparing or planning for these likely complications. Any thoughts on what needs to happen to prepare? What can start happening within the humanitarian sector to move beyond simply identifying potential risk?
Yeah, as you say, I think in the media and in the aid sector, there's this, the view on climate change is still quite, I would say, a baseline kind of level. There's, awareness of how it impacts some disasters, and in some cases, more than others. We know how it exacerbates emergencies, but what's less certain is how, planning and response change to account for this. I'm still waiting for the answer to that. Beyond just identifying it as a risk. A couple of weeks ago, the Red Cross released, I think, $200,000 in financing before a crisis. That's for extreme winter in Mongolia, and that's apparently the first time they've done that using a new financing model. I find that interesting. I'm interested in what other changes there will be beyond, just acknowledging that climate change is a factor. I'm sure there are other examples. But I think this year I'll be looking to see beyond just saying it's a risk, what people are actually doing about it, how that actually impacts something that is by nature reactionary. How do you prepare for something that's is a very sudden thing?
Thanks, Erwin. I imagine some of our questions will likely touch further on the impacts of climate change. And it's heartening to understand that the impacts of climate change have finally found their way into conversations and even some planning in humanitarian circles. How could they not? But an area that isn't spoken of too openly, though it's always front and center, is macroeconomic turbulence. That's a mouthful, but in our context, humanitarian crises, it basically means more risks for the most vulnerable.
We thought, looking at the huge waves of turbulence in the news, China, America, trade, Brexit, very high stock markets, but at the same time, very strange patterns in the bond markets. Although we're not at all economists, at least I speak for myself, clearly there's enough going on to make even the most bold market trader worry somewhat about 2020. So as then you start looking through that lens, so many recent sort of eruptions seem to come from relatively minor economic triggers. There's a sort of butterfly effect in the economy. So Sudan, for example, is somewhere where sort of economic pressures seem, at least in the immediate term, to have produced something good. So the increase of the price of fuel and bread caused protests. Those protests were unsuccessfully suppressed by the former regime, and a new dispensation has come through, which, if any of you have ever worked in South Sudan, I'm sure many of you have, the recent pictures from the Nuba Mountains is quite astonishing level of change in the political climate. So there's a good one. On the other hand, there's also some bad ones. And how would anybody have predicted that an attempt to tax WhatsApp would lead to 3 months of chaos in Lebanon and 200% bond interest rates and a crisis meeting between aid agencies and the Central Bank of Syria? So we feel we're conscious that we are not experts, and we're conscious also that, you know, the best brains and the biggest money bags in the world don't get to predict this very successfully. But we intend to ask this year, which of these things is going to blow up? Which of them is worth watching? Which of them could you at least try to model some scenarios around? And we're curious to know to what extent the aid industry, the aid enterprise is at all able to prepare or to predict or to analyze these sorts of things. So an inverted bond yield, I'm not sure I really entirely understand, but I do know that strange things are happening, and they could have huge impacts on jobs, economic health of struggling countries, and of course of the budgets of wealthy countries who pay for so much aid. So it's unpredictable, and some of it seems unprecedented, and we are buckling up, I think, for a tricky era. My other pet topic, a kind of unruly pet, frankly, is to do with data and digital, the digitalization of humanitarian things. We sort of put two categories to watch here. One is what is the use in a misuse kind of way, and another is the malicious use of digital data. And we think both of these things will continue to occupy the agenda for responders and for the management of humanitarian action. What's perhaps most novel is our feeling that the use of data and networking for malicious purposes, we think, will be seen even more in the fragile countries that we cover. If you look at the example of Myanmar, where its experience of ethnic cleansing was definitely fueled by Facebook, according to Facebook's own analysis. We are watching out for the election in Ethiopia, where there are dozens of languages that Facebook doesn't even have translation capacity on, and a well-established pattern of misinformation, hate speech, and ethnic derogatory language. So we think it's not just Trump and the Russians and Brexit and all that, where digital technology can be deliberately misused. And we think we'll see it more and more in some of these less wealthy countries that already have so many difficulties.
Thanks, Ben. Our next question, I'd like to turn to Obi. It's really a general question about the Sahel, just asking for a little more insight on what we're looking toward, what we'll be covering in 2020. Obi, anything to add?
I think it's more of the same, unfortunately. I think what we have a couple of projects. We'll be going back to the Sahel. I think we did some really pioneering work last year, but when we were going back to look at those kind of humanitarian implications of the insurgencies. So I think that's going to be quite exciting, and that will try and take a broader look at, okay, so we've got these really huge problems. How can we get around them? What are some of the smart ways of responding to these sorts of crises?
We have a collection of our reporting, the Sahel in Flames. We'll send out that link to all of you so you can take a deeper look on your own at what we've done. And as Obi says, keep on the lookout for some of our upcoming work. Obi, sticking with you, really, we have a question about food insecurity. And this is an excellent question because it taps into a number of the issues we're looking at. It's asking specifically if we foresee food insecurity becoming an issue as urban displacement increases. As it happens, we have a story coming out today on that issue in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is that really, the whole kind of urban space is going to be a whole new challenging area for humanitarians. What we're seeing, especially in Southern Africa, where we're seeing obviously the impact of climate change. And I think, some of the mitigation measures are going to be around social protection. So that's going to be not just for the rural populations, but we're seeing an acceptance that urban poverty is also a factor of climate change as prices are driven beyond the reach of people. So it's how do you do that? How do you set in place these kind of social protection measures, sort of social safety nets, when humanitarians don't really like operating in kind of an urban environment because it's tricky because people don't have IDs often, people move around a lot, so it's really difficult to target. So I think that's part of the challenge we'll be seeing, along with the displacement of people out of rural areas and into cities. And then we have the whole issue about urban planning and how do you provide services, how do you satisfy the needs of your own people, that kind of citizen subject issue. How do you include people who are on the margins as part of the community that deserves services and should be, the state should be fully accountable to.
Thanks, Obi. Erwin, I wonder if you might address this from another angle, from your seat in Asia. And I'll just also remind people that our answers are based on our reporting and what we're seeing out there. We don't have a crystal ball, and we're not really in the business of making predictions.
Yeah, I just, I find the issue interesting from a migration point of view. Last year in Bangladesh, we did a story looking at the links between climate change and the pre-monsoon rainfall that struck in 2017. And, a couple of years later, a lot of the villages in the Northeast, which is a key rice growing region, they were really emptying even 2 years after that disaster. And, if you look at the data and if you look at rice prices, the cost of rice soared, and as imports, came in, because obviously there was much less supply that year. And that really affected the community, but also, arguably the country to some level for the next year or two. So I think, as you get more of this sort of migration, with or without climate change, I think food is going to become increasingly important. But of course, migration is also a coping mechanism for many families with or without climate change. So it's remittances play a huge effect on these rural communities, and they change the local economy there as well. So it's it's not really an either or issue in terms of urban versus rural, but I think it's just an interesting one to look at and keep an eye out for as the reporting develops.
Thanks, Erwin. We have a question on DRC, specifically on militias in the Democratic Republic of Congo and their recruiting practices. Really, this is one part of what we're calling the perfect storm in DRC. Many of these conflicts are ongoing. Obi, maybe could you talk a little bit about why we're highlighting these conflicts now and other ingredients in this so-called perfect storm?
Yeah, because they tend to be overlooked, and DRC is a vast country with vast problems. So we have the militia issue, and some of these are poorly understood. I mean, some people are joining purely to make money. Some are joining as kind of self-defense units to protect their communities. And then on top, and that's kind of layered with a measles epidemic, which has claimed 6,000 lives. We have a cholera outbreak. And of course, we've got the Ebola crisis as well, which is not yet abating. So DRC is one of those countries that thankfully we have one of our senior editors based there that we can keep an eye on. But it's a difficult situation.
Thanks, Obi. And we also have a pretty vast collection of reporting from DRC. We can also send you all a link to that so you can investigate what we have and keep an eye on our upcoming reporting. We have a couple questions on Syria, which of course is always on our radar, and it was among the crises we discussed when putting together our list. We've been reporting from and on Syria for 9 years and counting, with our most recent coverage out of Idlib, following some of the 350,000 civilians who began their new year by fleeing a new barrage of fighting. Annie, what's the aid situation like now for those who have fled Idlib, and maybe even for those who haven't? And bigger picture, what are you watching in Syria?
Idlib, as you said, the numbers are not great. We're talking about 350,000 people who have been displaced since December. As I've said in reporting before, I think the word displacement doesn't necessarily really capture how horrible it is when you have to flee your home in the middle of violence. These people, we reported this time when people were fleeing, they really felt that it was different than past times, and that they had brought their doors, their windows, their water tanks, their faucets, in addition to their clothing, because they thought, you know, this is really the end. Whether that's true or not is another question, but it's a symbol of really how desperate people are. You know, the aid situation is ever changing, although we did see recently the Security Council is going to allow aid to, at least the UN, to continue bringing aid into the Northwest, where there are an estimated, I think the estimates are between 2.5 million and 3 million people. I say this with every country, we can never really be sure of the numbers. There are people living in camps, and it was raining today, so you can imagine, especially in makeshift camps, how bad that is. There are people living in homes with friends, family, people living in mosques, people living in schools. And a lot of these people who have had to flee recently have had to flee a lot of times. A lot of them aren't even from Idlib originally. They've left from other places where the government has retaken control. So I think there's a sort of chaotic, there's a sense of chaos on the ground, especially since the ceasefire that I think it was a week ago took hold, doesn't really seem to have held. But this is really just one pocket of Syria. Of course, it is the one that has seen the most dramatic escalation in the last few weeks. But, you know, a few months before that, or a few weeks before that, we were talking about Northeast Syria. And the fact is that the war, you know, it just still isn't over. And at the same time as we're trying to cover people who are having to flee this new offensive, we're also looking at, or we will be looking at, people who are returning and what that means, how they do that, if they can do that safely, what kind of aid they get when they do that, or if they do that, and, you know, what kind of decisions people have to make when they leave behind their family members from somewhere like Jordan or Lebanon, why they do that. So these are some of the things we'll be keeping an eye on, but there's a lot in Syria to talk about, as you know.
Here's a more general question, a broader question, which is, what does the emergence of new crises mean for the stretching of international humanitarian organizations' efforts? For example, UNHCR, IOM, etc. This brings to mind a lot of the work we've done on local aid, and the emphasis on local aid providers. And Erwin, is this something you could talk to us a bit about?
You know, when we're talking about you know, new crises and stretching of budgets, I think we're also talking about new responders. You know, different types of people who are potentially responding to crises, but are not necessarily viewed as you know, being humanitarians. And I think, you know, that's going to change slowly, but, you know, already, I think, you know, this has happened in any crisis since the beginning of time. Who are the first people to respond? It's the people who live there. But you know, as you know, I think international aid dollars, you know, continue to fall short of you know, the response needs. I think you know, people will have to look a bit more about, think a bit more about how these various groups and communities are incorporated into responses. And I guess the other aspect of that I see is also with, you know, women responders and women-led organizations. particularly local ones. I think they're often left out of the equation, and I'm interested in seeing how donor policy will factor that in the future, because there are many different reasons why this happens, and I think donor and INGO policy can probably take a a bit more effort to see what's going on there, because it's not just simply a matter of just ignoring responders. There are policies that happen to make this happen.
Thanks, Erwin. And also another very rich vein for our reporting. I will ask all of you to please follow our ongoing coverage of our 10 crises and trends on the newhumanitarian.org. We do a mid-year update on each entry, and throughout the year, you'll be able to find our latest coverage by going to the main 10 crises article and clicking on the, wait for it, read our most recent coverage link at the end of each entry. And we're quite serious when we ask you to get in touch. You reach out to any of us, social media, email. You'll find our contacts on the bios page under About Us. And we will be sending you an email this week with an audio file of this webinar. We'll share our contact info and some of the links to some of the coverage we've mentioned during our discussion. Please share all of that with your networks. That wraps up our first Behind the Headlines webinar. Thank you for joining us and for your interest in our coverage from places and people much of the world overlooks, and for helping us put TNH's journalism at the service of hundreds of millions of men, women, and children hoping to rebuild their lives and livelihoods in 2020. We hope to see you at our next webinar. Thanks.